The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of eastern Afghanistan as Chief Petty Officer Marcus Tank Rodriguez checked his gear one final time. The weight of his rifle felt familiar in his hands, a comfort he had come to rely on during his 8 deployments to this unforgiving landscape. Around him, his team of Navy SEALs moved with practiced efficiency, their movements silent despite the heavy equipment each man carried. "Radio check," whispered Lieutenant Commander Jake "Bulldog" Peterson into his headset. The responses came back crisp and clear from each member of the 6-man team. They were deep in Taliban territory, 20 miles from the nearest friendly forces, on a mission that had taken months of intelligence gathering to plan. The target was a high-value Taliban commander known as the Ghost, a man responsible for coordinating attacks that had killed dozens of coalition forces over the past year. Intelligence suggested he would be meeting with foreign fighters at a compound nestled in a valley surrounded by steep mountain ridges. The meeting was scheduled for today, and this was their only chance to capture or eliminate him. Petty Officer First Class David Reaper Thompson crouched behind a boulder, his sniper rifle trained on the compound below. Through his scope, he could see guards moving around the perimeter. The building was larger than their intelligence had indicated, and there were more enemy fighters present than expected. "Bulldog, this doesn't look right," Thompson whispered into his radio. "I count at least 15 tangos, maybe more inside. Intel said we'd be looking at 6 to 8 maximum." Peterson felt his stomach tighten. Bad intelligence was every operator's nightmare, but they had come too far to turn back now. The Ghost had evaded capture for too long, and this opportunity might not come again. "We adapt and overcome," Peterson replied quietly. "Stick to the plan, but stay flexible." The team had inserted via helicopter before dawn, fast roping into a landing zone 3 kilometers from the target. The pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Phoenix Mitchell, had flown them in under cover of darkness, navigating treacherous mountain terrain with night vision goggles. Her Apache helicopter was now stationed at a forward operating base 40 minutes away, on standby for extraction or close air support if needed. Mitchell was one of the few female Apache pilots in the Army, and she had earned her call sign Phoenix after surviving a crash landing in Iraq during her previous deployment. She had a reputation for being fearless and precise, qualities that had earned the respect of the special operations community. As the SEALs moved into position, each man knew his role. Rodriguez and Petty Officer Second Class Tommy "Ghost" Martinez would breach the main entrance. Thompson would provide overwatch from his sniper position. Petty Officer Second Class Kevin Hammer Williams and Petty Officer Third Class Jake Rookie Anderson would secure the rear exit. Peterson would coordinate the assault and call in air support if necessary. The compound sat in a natural bowl surrounded by rocky ridges on 3 sides. The only approach was down a narrow valley that offered little cover. It was a defensive position that any military tactician would appreciate, and it should have been a red flag that something was wrong. At 0800 hours, the team began their descent toward the target. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of whine through the rocks and the occasional call of a bird. Each step was calculated, each movement deliberate. They had trained for this type of operation countless times, but real combat always brought variables that no training scenario could fully replicate. Rodriguez felt sweat building under his body armor despite the cool morning air. Something felt off about this mission, though he couldn't put his finger on what. He had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and right now those instincts were telling him to be ready for anything. Through his radio earpiece, he heard Thompson's voice, barely above a whisper. "Movement on the ridgeline, 11 o'clock. 2 figures with what looks like RPGs." Peterson's mind raced. RPGs meant they were dealing with more than just a meeting of Taliban leaders. This was starting to look like a prepared ambush position. He had to make a decision: abort the mission and lose their target, or continue forward and risk his team's lives. "Continue mission," he decided. "All stations, weapons tight until my command. Reaper, keep eyes on those RPGs." The team reached the final approach to the compound. From their position, they could see that the building was actually a complex of 3 interconnected structures. The walls were thick stone, and firing ports had been cut into them at regular intervals. This wasn't just a meeting place, it was a fortress. Martinez keyed his radio. "Bulldog, this place is built like a bunker. These walls are going to stop anything short of a tank round." The original plan had called for a quick breach and clear operation. The team would storm the building, capture or eliminate the ghost, and be extracted within 30 minutes. But the reality on the ground was far different from what their intelligence had suggested. Peterson made another command decision. Change of plans. We go with deliberate clearing procedures. Reaper maintains overwatch. Everyone else, we do this slow and steady. As they moved closer to the compound, the sound of voices became audible. The SEALs could hear men speaking in Pashto and Arabic, confirming the presence of foreign fighters. The number of voices suggested far more than the 6 to 8 combatants they had expected. Thompson, watching through his scope, saw movement on multiple ridgelines surrounding the valley. His blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. "Bulldog, we've got a problem. I count at least 30 fighters positioned on the high ground around us. We're walking into a kill box." The realization hit Peterson like a physical blow. This wasn't an intelligence failure. This was a trap. Someone had fed them false information, leading them into a carefully prepared ambush. The Ghost wasn't here for a meeting with foreign fighters. He was here to eliminate a Navy SEAL team. "All stations, prepare for immediate extraction," Peterson ordered. But even as he spoke, he knew they were in serious trouble. The helicopter was 40 minutes away, and they were surrounded by enemy fighters with a high ground advantage. The first shot came from the ridgeline to their east. A sniper's bullet struck the rock inches from Rodriguez's head, sending stone fragments flying. Within seconds, the entire valley erupted in gunfire. Muzzle flashes appeared on all 3 ridge lines as Taliban fighters opened fire with automatic weapons. "Contact! Contact!" Peterson shouted into his radio. "All stations, find cover and return fire." The SEALs dove behind boulders and rock formations as bullets whistled overhead. The carefully planned mission had turned into a desperate fight for survival in a matter of seconds. They were outnumbered at least 5 to 1, with enemies holding commanding positions on the high ground. Williams, trapped behind a small boulder that barely covered his body, fired controlled bursts at muzzle flashes on the ridgeline. "We're pinned down," he shouted. "I can't move without drawing fire." Anderson, the youngest member of the team, had his first taste of real combat as bullets cracked over his head. His training took over as he returned fire, but his hand shook slightly as he changed magazines. Thompson, in his sniper position, began engaging enemy fighters on the ridgelines. His precision rifle cracked repeatedly as he took careful shots at exposed targets. "2 down on the eastern ridge," he reported. But for every fighter he eliminated, 2 more seemed to take their place. The Taliban fighters had clearly been planning this ambush for some time. Their positions were well prepared, with sandbags and rock barriers providing excellent cover. Some carried RPGs, while others had PCAM machine guns that sent streams of bullets down into the valley floor where the SEALs were trapped. Rodriguez and Martinez found themselves cut off from the rest of the team, pinned behind a rock formation near the compound entrance. Bullets sparked off the stones around them, and they could hear the angry buzz of near misses. "We need to move," Martinez shouted over the gunfire. "We're sitting ducks here." But movement meant exposure, and exposure meant death in the kill zone they found themselves in. The Taliban fighters had planned their ambush well, creating overlapping fields of fire that made movement nearly impossible. Peterson, coordinating the team's response while returning fire, got on the radio to call for immediate close air support. Phoenix, this is Bulldog. We're in contact with approximately 30 enemy fighters. We need immediate air support at grid coordinates." He rattled off their position while bullets cracked overhead. 40 minutes away, Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Mitchell was conducting routine maintenance checks on her Apache helicopter when the emergency call came through. She and her co-pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Mark Blade Stevens, had been monitoring the SEAL's radio frequency, but the mission was supposed to be a simple snatch and grab operation. "Phoenix, this is Bulldog," came the urgent voice through her headset. "We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Request immediate close air support. We are pinned down and taking casualties." Mitchell's training kicked in immediately. She began the Apache startup sequence while Stevens plotted the fastest route to the SEAL's position. The helicopter's twin engines began their characteristic whine as the rotors started turning. "Bulldog, this is Phoenix," she replied calmly into radio. "We're spinning up now. ETA to your position is 38 minutes. Can you hold until then?" Back in the valley, Peterson ducked as an RPG exploded against the rocks above his position, showering him with debris. 38 minutes might as well have been 38 hours given their current situation. "Negative, Phoenix. We need support now. We are being overrun." The intensity of the enemy fire was increasing. The Taliban fighters were beginning to move down from their positions on the ridgelines, trying to get close enough for a final assault. The SEALs' superior training and equipment were keeping them alive, but they were rapidly running low on ammunition. Thompson, still in his sniper position, had a better view of the tactical situation than anyone else. What he saw made his blood run cold. "Bulldog, they're massing for an assault on the eastern ridge. At least 20 fighters moving down toward your position." The Taliban commander directing the ambush had clearly studied American special operations tactics. He was using the classic hammer and anvil approach, fixing the SEALs in place with suppressive fire while moving fighters into position for a final assault. Rodriguez, trapped near the compound, made a desperate decision. "I'm going to try to reach that building," he told Martinez. "We need better cover than these rocks." "That's suicide," Martinez replied. "You'll have to cross 30 meters of open ground." But their current position was becoming untenable. The rocks that had initially provided cover were being chipped away by constant gunfire, and soon they would offer no protection at all. Rodriguez took several deep breaths, checked his rifle, and prepared to move. "Cover me." Martinez opened fire on full automatic, spraying bullets at the ridgeline positions while Rodriguez sprinted across the open ground. Enemy fire erupted in response, bullets kicking up dirt around Rodriguez's feet as he ran in a zigzag pattern toward the compound. He dove through the doorway of the nearest building just as an RPG exploded where he had been standing seconds before. Inside, he found himself face to face with 3 Taliban fighters who had been preparing to reinforce their comrades outside. The close-quarters battle that followed was brutal and decisive. Rodriguez's years of training and room clearing took over as he engaged the enemy fighters at point-blank range. Within seconds, all 3 Taliban fighters were down, but the sound of gunfire from inside the building alerted their comrades outside. "Building cleared," Rodriguez reported breathlessly into his radio. "But I've stirred up a hornet's nest. They know I'm in here." Outside, Martinez found himself alone and increasingly exposed as enemy fire focused on his position. He could see muzzle flashes from multiple directions as the Taliban fighters adjusted their positions to deal with the new threat from inside their compound. Peterson realized that his team was being systematically destroyed by a well-coordinated enemy force. They needed air support, and they needed it now. But Phoenix was still 30 minutes away, and at their current rate of ammunition expenditure, they would be out of bullets long before then. "All stations, conserve ammunition," he ordered. "Aim fire only. Make every shot count." But controlled fire wouldn't stop a determined assault by overwhelming numbers. The Taliban fighters were beginning to move more aggressively, using fire and movement tactics to close the distance to the SEALs' positions. Williams, pinned behind his boulder, could see enemy fighters moving through the rocks less than 50 meters away. "They're getting close," he reported. "I can see their faces." Anderson, fighting in his first real combat engagement, was performing better than anyone expected. His rifle fire was accurate and controlled, but his ammunition was running dangerously low. 2 magazines left, he reported. Thompson, from his sniper position, was doing his best to slow the enemy advance by picking off key targets. But even his precision shooting couldn't stop the overwhelming numbers moving against his teammates. The Apache helicopter carrying Mitchell and Stevens was flying at maximum speed across the rugged Afghan landscape. Mitchell pushed the aircraft to its limits, knowing that every second could mean the difference between life and death for the SEAL team. "How much longer?" Stevens asked, monitoring their progress on the navigation system. 26 minutes, Mitchell replied grimly. They need to hold on. But 26 minutes was looking increasingly impossible. In the valley, the SEALs were fighting the battle of their lives against overwhelming odds, and their ammunition was running out fast. The Taliban fighters, sensing victory, began to close in for the final assault. The situation in the valley was deteriorating rapidly. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, trapped inside the compound building, could hear enemy fighters shouting to each other as they coordinated their assault. Through a crack in the stone wall, he watched Taliban fighters moving between the rocks outside, their AK-47 rifles gleaming in the morning sun. Outside the building, Martinez was down to his last magazine. Sweat poured down his face as he tried to make every shot count. The boulder that had provided him cover was now barely half its original size, chipped away by constant enemy fire. Rock fragments had cut his face in several places, and blood mixed with dirt and sweat. "Bulldog, I'm almost black on ammo," Martinez reported quietly into his radio. Black on ammo meant no ammunition left, a death sentence in their current situation. Lieutenant Commander Peterson, coordinating the defense from his position behind a cluster of rocks, felt the weight of command pressing down on him. Every decision could mean life or death for his men. He had led teams through difficult situations before, but nothing like this. "All stations, sound off with ammunition status," he ordered. The responses came back quickly, and each one was worse than the last. Williams had one magazine remaining. Anderson was down to his last 30 rounds. Thompson, the sniper, had enough ammunition for maybe 10 more precise shots. Only Peterson himself had a reasonable amount of ammunition left, and even that wouldn't last long at their current rate of fire. The Taliban fighters seemed to sense their advantage. Their fire increased in intensity, and Peterson could see movement on all three ridge lines as they prepared for a coordinated assault. The enemy commander was clearly experienced, using classic military tactics to destroy the SEAL team. From his elevated position, Thompson had the best view of the developing tactical situation. What he saw made his stomach drop. "Bulldog, they're moving at least 15 fighters down the eastern slope. Another 10 coming down the western approach. They're going to hit us from 3 directions simultaneously." This was the classic military maneuver known as a pincer movement, designed to crush an enemy force between converging attacks. The Taliban had clearly studied American special operations tactics and were using them against the SEALs. Rodriguez, inside the compound building, could hear footsteps on the roof above him. The enemy fighters were positioning themselves to attack from above as well as from ground level. He found a position that gave him cover from both the doorway and any holes they might blast through the roof. "Ghost, how's your ammunition?" Peterson asked Rodriguez over the radio. "I've got maybe 60 rounds left," Rodriguez replied. "But I'm about to have company. They're moving on the building." The building Rodriguez had taken shelter in was more substantial than it had appeared from the outside. The walls were thick stone, probably built to withstand the harsh Afghan winters, but they would also stop small arms fire. The problem was that the building had multiple entrances, and Rodriguez couldn't cover them all simultaneously. Outside, the sound of the approaching enemy assault was growing louder. The Taliban fighters were shouting instructions to each other in Pashto and Arabic, their voices carrying across the rocky terrain. Some of the foreign fighters were speaking what sounded like Chechen or Uzbek, indicating this was indeed an international terrorist gathering. Peterson made a tactical decision that went against every instinct he had developed over years of special operations. "All stations, fall back to the building. We consolidate our position there." Moving from their current positions to the building would require crossing open ground under enemy fire. It was incredibly dangerous, but staying in their current positions meant being overrun by superior numbers. At least in the building, they could create a more defensible position. "Reaper, can you provide covering fire for the movement?" Peterson asked Thompson. "Roger, but I'm down to 8 rounds," Thompson replied. "Make it fast." Williams was the first to move. He sprinted from his boulder toward the building, dodging between rocks as enemy fire erupted around him. Thompson's sniper rifle cracked 4 times in rapid succession, each shot aimed at an enemy fighter who was trying to track Williams with his weapon. Williams dove through the building's doorway, rolling to avoid Rodriguez's defensive fire before identifying himself. "Friendly coming in," he shouted just before rolling through the entrance. Anderson went next, his young legs carrying him quickly across the dangerous open ground. An RPG exploded behind him as he ran, the blast wave knocking him forward but not seriously injuring him. He tumbled into the building, breathing heavily but intact. Martinez's movement was the most dangerous because he had the farthest to travel. He had been trapped behind his disintegrating boulder for almost an hour, and the enemy fighters had a clear line of sight to his position. When he finally made his break for the building, it seemed like every Taliban fighter in the valley opened fire on him. Bullets whined past his ears and kicked up dirt around his feet as he ran in a zigzag pattern. Halfway to the building, he stumbled and went down hard. For a moment, Peterson thought they had lost him. "Martinez is hit," Anderson shouted from inside the building. But Martinez wasn't hit. He had tripped over a loose rock. He scrambled to his feet and completed his sprint to the building, diving through the doorway as enemy fire intensified around the entrance. Now Peterson had to make his own run for the building. As the team leader, he would go last to ensure all his men made it safely. Thompson would have to abandon his sniper position and make the longest run of all from the ridgeline down to the valley floor and then to the building. "Reaper, time to move," Peterson ordered. "Everyone else, provide covering fire." Thompson quickly packed his sniper rifle and began his descent from the ridgeline. The movement immediately drew enemy attention, and several fighters began tracking him with their weapons. From the building, the other SEALs opened fire with their remaining ammunition, trying to suppress the enemy long enough for Thompson to reach safety. Peterson waited until Thompson was halfway to the building before making his own move. As the team leader, he carried extra ammunition and equipment, making him slower than the others. Enemy fire intensified as the Taliban fighters realized the Americans were consolidating their position. An RPG round exploded just meters away from Peterson as he ran, the blast throwing him to the ground. His ears were ringing, and he could taste blood in his mouth, but he forced himself to get up and continue running. Behind him, he could hear enemy fighters shouting as they began their final assault. Thompson reached the building first, followed seconds later by Peterson. All 6 SEALs were now consolidated in the stone structure, but their situation was still desperate. They were surrounded, low on ammunition, and facing overwhelming numbers. Rodriguez quickly briefed the team on the building's layout. Single large room with 2 windows and 1 door. Stone walls about 2 feet thick. There's a ladder leading to the roof, but going up there would be suicide. Williams immediately moved to one of the windows and began engaging enemy fighters who were advancing across the open ground. "They're coming from all directions," he reported. "This is going to get nasty." Anderson took position at the other window while Martinez covered the doorway. Peterson got on the radio to update their air support on the changed situation. "Phoenix, this is Bulldog. We have consolidated in a building at grid reference." He provided the updated coordinates. "We are surrounded and low on ammunition. How much longer until you arrive?" The response came back immediately. "Bulldog, this is Phoenix. We are 22 minutes out. Can you hold?" 22 minutes might as well have been 22 hours. Outside, the enemy fire was intensifying as Taliban fighters moved closer to the building. They were using classic siege tactics, gradually tightening the noose around their trapped prey. Thompson, looking through one of the windows, could see enemy fighters positioning themselves behind rocks and in shallow depressions around the building. "They're setting up for a coordinated assault," he reported. "I count at least 25 fighters in position." The first serious assault came from the east side of the building. A group of Taliban fighters rushed forward, firing on full automatic as they tried to reach the wall where they could use grenades or explosives. Williams and Anderson opened fire from the windows, their precise shooting stopping the attack shore of the building. Two down, but they'll try again, Williams reported. And I'm down to my last magazine. Peterson realized they needed to conserve ammunition for the critical moments ahead. Controlled fire only, he ordered. Don't shoot unless you have a clear target and a high probability of a hit. But controlled fire wouldn't stop determined attackers for long. The Taliban fighters regrouped and tried again, this time approaching from multiple directions simultaneously. The SEALs' disciplined shooting stopped most of the attackers, but several reached the walls of the building. The explosion that followed shook the entire structure. One of the Taliban fighters had detonated a satchel charge against the wall, creating a hole large enough for a man to crawl through. Dust and debris filled the air as chunks of stone fell from the ceiling. Breach in the east wall, Rodriguez shouted, swinging his rifle toward the new opening. Enemy fighters immediately tried to exploit the breach, but Rodriguez was ready for them. His rifle fired in controlled bursts as he engaged attackers trying to crawl through the hole. The narrow opening worked in his favor, creating a fatal funnel that limited how many enemies could attack at once. Martinez, covering the main doorway, saw movement outside. They're massing for another assault on the door, he reported. At least 10 fighters. The building was slowly being surrounded by enemy fighters who were getting bolder as they realized the Americans were running out of ammunition. Thompson, at the north window, could see Taliban fighters moving heavy weapons into position. They're bringing up an RPG, he reported. If they get a direct hit on this building, we're done. Peterson made a decision that surprised everyone. We're going to have to break out of here before they can consolidate their position. If we stay, they'll eventually overwhelm us or bring the building down on our heads. Where can we go? Anderson asked. We're surrounded. Peterson studied the tactical situation. To the north of the building was a small ravine that led deeper into the mountains. It offered the only possible escape route, but reaching it would require fighting through enemy positions. We make a run for the ravine, he decided. It's our only chance. Rodriguez looked at his ammunition. About maybe 30 rounds left. How are we going to fight through that many enemies? We don't fight through them, Peterson replied. We punch a hole and run like hell. The plan was simple but dangerous. Thompson would use his remaining sniper ammunition to engage the RPG team before they could fire on the building. The rest of the team would assault through the north window, trying to reach the ravine before the enemy could respond. On my mark, Peterson said, preparing to coordinate the breakout attempt. But before he could give the order, the sound of rotors echoed across the valley. At first, Peterson thought it might be the Taliban bringing in reinforcements by helicopter, but the sound was wrong. These rotors had the distinctive whop, whop, whop of an American aircraft. Aircraft approaching from the south, Thompson reported, looking through his window. It's one of ours. But the aircraft was still too far away to provide immediate support. The Taliban fighters around the building were preparing for another assault, and this one would likely succeed. The SEALs were down to their last few magazines of ammunition, and the enemy was closing in from all sides. Chief Warrant Officer Mitchell pushed her Apache helicopter to maximum speed as she approached the valley where the SEALs were trapped. Through her targeting system, she could see the building where they had taken shelter, surrounded by numerous enemy positions. Jesus, Stevens muttered from the co-pilot's seat. Look at all those heat signatures. The Apache's thermal imaging system showed at least 30 enemy fighters positioned around the building. They were well dispersed and using good cover, making them difficult targets for airstrikes. But Mitchell had trained for exactly this type of close air support mission. Bulldog, this is Phoenix, she radioed to the SEALs. We are inbound to your position. Can you mark your location? Phoenix, we are in the stone building at the center of the valley, Peterson replied. Enemy positions surrounding us on all sides. Be advised, we're danger close to enemy forces. Danger close meant the SEALs were so near to enemy positions that any airstrike carried significant risk of hitting friendly forces. It required precision that few pilots possessed, but Mitchell had built her reputation on exactly this type of flying. Copy danger close, she replied calmly. We are beginning our attack. Run now. The Apache banked sharply as Mitchell lined up her first target. Through the aircraft's sophisticated targeting system, she could see Taliban fighters positioned behind rocks around the building. Her finger moved to the trigger for the helicopter's 30mm chain gun. "Beginning gun run," she announced. The Apache's chain gun opened fire with its characteristic buzzsaw sound. The 30mm rounds tore into the rocky positions where Taliban fighters had taken cover, sending up clouds of dust and debris. Several enemy positions were silenced immediately. Inside the building, the SEALs cheered as they heard the sound of incoming air support. The psychological effect was immediate. They were no longer alone and abandoned. Help had arrived, but the Taliban fighters were experienced veterans who had faced American air power before. They quickly adapted their tactics, spreading out and taking cover in positions that were harder for the helicopter to target. "Phoenix, be advised, enemy forces are dispersing," Peterson reported. "They're moving to positions with better cover." Mitchell acknowledged the report and adjusted her attack pattern. This was going to be a complex engagement requiring multiple attack runs and precise targeting. The SEALs' lives depended on her ability to eliminate the enemy forces without hitting the building where they were sheltering. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since the ambush began, the SEALs had reason to hope they might survive the day. Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Mitchell banked the Apache helicopter sharply to the left as tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit. The Taliban fighters had responded to her initial gun run by revealing hidden anti-aircraft positions on the ridgelines. Green tracers lit up the morning sky as they tried to bring down the American helicopter. "They've got heavy machine guns on the high ground," Stevens reported from the co-pilot's seat, scanning the ridgelines through his targeting system. "At least 3 positions with overlapping fields of fire." Mitchell grimaced as she pulled the Apache into a defensive maneuver. The enemy had planned this ambush well, positioning anti-aircraft weapons to defend against the very air support that American forces relied upon. But she hadn't earned her call sign Phoenix by backing down from a fight. "We need to take out those gun positions before we can effectively support the ground team," she told Stevens. "Mark the targets." In the building below, the SEALs could hear the Apache engaging enemy positions, but they could also hear the enemy return fire. Rodriguez, watching through a crack in the wall, saw tracer rounds arcing up toward the helicopter. "They're trying to shoot down our air support," he reported to Peterson. "If we lose that bird, we're done." Peterson got on the radio to Mitchell. "Phoenix, be advised, enemy has significant anti-aircraft capability. Multiple heavy machine gun positions on the ridgelines." "Copy that, Bulldog," Mitchell replied calmly. "We're working on suppressing those positions now." But suppressing well-positioned anti-aircraft guns was easier said than done. The Taliban fighters had positioned their weapons in caves and rock crevices that provided excellent protection from air attack. They would fire a few bursts at the helicopter, then quickly pull back into cover before Mitchell could return fire. Stevens worked frantically with the Apache's targeting systems, trying to get precise coordinates on the enemy gun positions. "There," he called out. "Cave entrance at grid 41S QP 12345678890. I can see muzzle flashes." Mitchell rolled the Apache into an attack run, lining up the cave entrance in her targeting system. The helicopter's Hellfire missiles were designed for precision strikes against hardened targets like this. She selected a missile and waited for the targeting computer to achieve lock-on. "Hellfire away," she announced as the missile streaked away from the helicopter. The missile impacted the cave entrance with a massive explosion, sealing it with tons of rock and eliminating the anti-aircraft position. But 2 other positions continued firing, their green tracers reaching up toward the Apache like deadly fingers. Inside the building, the SEALs were facing a renewed ground assault. The Taliban fighters had used the distraction of the air battle to move closer to the building. Williams, watching through the north window, saw enemies moving through the rocks less than 20 meters away. "They're closing in," he reported. Multiple fighters approaching from the north and east. Anderson, at the other window, was down to his last few rounds. "I count 8, maybe 10 fighters moving on our position. They're using fire and movement tactics." The enemy fighters were indeed using professional military tactics, with some providing covering fire while others moved forward. It was clear that these weren't just local Taliban fighters. They were trained foreign fighters who understood modern combat techniques. Martinez, still covering the main entrance, could hear voices right outside the door. The Taliban fighters were coordinating their assault in multiple languages, indicating the international nature of the force they were facing. "Grenades!" Rodriguez shouted suddenly. A fragmentation grenade bounced through the hole that had been blown in the east wall. Rodriguez and Williams dove for cover as the grenade exploded, filling the room with smoke and debris. Shrapnel peppered the walls, but, miraculously, none of the SEALs were seriously injured. Before the smoke could clear, Taliban fighters tried to assault through both the breach and the main door simultaneously. The confined space of the building turned into a deadly shooting gallery as the SEALs engaged attackers at point-blank range. Thompson's rifle cracked repeatedly as he engaged fighters trying to crawl through the breach. Martinez sprayed automatic fire at the main entrance as multiple enemies tried to force their way inside. The noise was deafening in the enclosed space. Peterson, coordinating the defense while engaging targets himself, realized they were reaching the breaking point. "All stations, ammunition status," he called out between bursts of gunfire. The responses were grim. Williams had no ammunition left and was down to his sidearm. Anderson was completely out of rifle ammo. Martinez had less than a dozen rounds remaining. Only Rodriguez and Peterson had any significant ammunition left, and even that wouldn't last long. "We need that air support now," Peterson radioed to Mitchell. "We're about to be overrun." But Mitchell was dealing with her own problems. The remaining anti-aircraft positions were keeping her at a distance, preventing her from providing effective close air support to the SEALs. Every time she tried to move closer to the building, enemy fire forced her to take evasive action. "I'm working on it, Bulldog," she replied, her voice strained as she maneuvered the Apache through another barrage of anti-aircraft fire. "But these gun positions have us pinned down too." Stevens had an idea. "What if we use the terrain to mask our approach? Come in low from the west, use that ridge line for cover." Mitchell studied the tactical situation on her display. The western approach would hide them from two of the anti-aircraft positions, but it would also put them dangerously close to the mountain ridges. Flying an Apache helicopter through narrow mountain valleys at high speed was incredibly risky. "It's our best option," she decided. "Hang on." The Apache dropped suddenly, diving toward the valley floor before turning west and racing along a narrow ravine that paralleled the main valley. Mitchell flew the helicopter just meters above the rocky terrain, using her night vision system to navigate between boulders and cliff faces. "This is insane," Stevens muttered as rocks flashed past the cockpit windows. But the maneuver worked. By approaching from an unexpected direction at extremely low altitude, Mitchell was able to avoid the anti-aircraft fire and position the Apache where it could effectively engage the enemy forces around the building. "Bulldog, this is Phoenix," she radioed to the SEALs. "We are beginning close air support runs. Keep your heads down." The Apache's 30mm chain gun opened fire with devastating effect. The high explosive rounds tore into the Taliban positions around the building, sending up geysers of dirt and rock. Enemy fighters who had been advancing on the building suddenly found themselves under attack from an unexpected direction. Inside the building, the SEALs could hear the distinctive sound of the Apache's weapons systems engaging targets around their position. The enemy assault that had been building suddenly faltered as Taliban fighters dove for cover. "That's what I'm talking about," Williams shouted over the noise. "Give them hell, Phoenix." But Mitchell's low-altitude attack run had exposed the Apache to ground fire from small arms and rocket-propelled grenades. Warning lights flashed on the helicopter's dashboard as enemy bullets found their mark. "We're taking hits," Stevens reported, scanning the aircraft systems. "Hydraulics are fluctuating, and we've got damage to the tail rotor assembly." Mitchell felt the helicopter shudder as enemy fire continued to rake the aircraft. An RPG exploded just meters away, the blast wave rocking the Apache violently. But she maintained her attack run, knowing that the lives of the SEAL team depended on suppressing the enemy forces. The Apache's weapons were having a devastating effect on the Taliban positions. The 30mm rounds were designed to penetrate light armor and fortified positions, and they were tearing apart the rock formations where enemy fighters had taken cover. Multiple enemy Kia, Stevens reported, watching the thermal imaging system. But we've still got active positions on the eastern ridge. Mitchell lined up another gun run, but as she turned the Apache toward the eastern ridge, disaster struck. An enemy fighter with an RPG had positioned himself in a location Mitchell couldn't see from her current angle. The rocket-propelled grenade struck the Apache's tail rotor assembly with a brilliant flash. The helicopter immediately began spinning out of control as the damaged tail rotor could no longer counteract the torque from the main rotor system. Warning alarms filled the cockpit as Mitchell fought to maintain control of the aircraft. "Mayday, mayday," Stevens called out over the radio. "Phoenix is going down. We are going down." Inside the building, the SEALs watched in horror as their air support spun wildly through the sky, trailing smoke from its damaged tail section. Without the Apache's fire support, they would be completely at the mercy of the Taliban fighters. "Phoenix is hit," Peterson reported unnecessarily to his team. "We're on our own again." Mitchell used every bit of her considerable skill to prevent the Apache from crashing into the mountainside. She had been through a crash landing before in Iraq, and she wasn't about to let it happen again. Fighting against the helicopter's violent spinning motion, she looked for a place to put the aircraft down. The only available landing area was a small flat section of the valley floor about half a kilometer from where the SEALs were trapped. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only option available. "Brace for impact," she called to Stevens as she prepared for a hard landing. The Apache hit the ground with tremendous force, bouncing once before sliding to a stop in a cloud of dust and debris. Both pilots were shaken, but alive, though Stevens had suffered a serious gash on his forehead from flying debris. "You okay?" Mitchell asked, unbuckling her harness and checking her co-pilot for injuries. "I'll live," Stevens replied, wiping blood from his forehead. "But our bird is finished." The Apache's tail boom had been nearly severed by the RPG impact, and the main rotor blades were damaged from the hard landing. The helicopter wouldn't be flying again anytime soon. But Mitchell wasn't thinking about the aircraft. She was thinking about the SEAL team that was still trapped and fighting for their lives. Through her radio headset, she could hear the sounds of ongoing combat from the building where they had taken shelter. "Bulldog, this is Phoenix," she radioed. "We are down but alive. What's your status?" Peterson's voice came back strained and urgent. "Phoenix, we are still under heavy attack. Maybe 20 enemy fighters still in the fight. We are critically low on ammunition." Mitchell made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew her. Instead of waiting for rescue, she was going to help rescue the SEALs herself. "Stevens, grab your rifle and all the ammunition you can carry," she ordered. "We're going to help them." Stevens looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "We're helicopter pilots, not infantry. What can we do against 20 Taliban fighters?" Mitchell was already checking her M4 carbine and gathering extra ammunition. "We can even the odds a little. Those guys saved our lives more than once. Now it's our turn." The Apache carried survival weapons for exactly this type of situation. In addition to their sidearms, both pilots had M4 carbines with several hundred rounds of ammunition. It wasn't much against 20 enemy fighters, but it was better than nothing. Besides, Mitchell added grimly, "If the SEALs get overrun, we're next. Our best chance of survival is to help them hold out until reinforcements arrive." Stevens knew she was right. Alone and on foot in Taliban territory, 2 downed helicopter pilots wouldn't last long. Their best hope was to link up with the SEAL team and fight together. "Let's do it," he agreed, grabbing his rifle and additional ammunition. As they prepared to leave the crashed helicopter, Mitchell got on the radio one more time. "Bulldog, this is Phoenix. We are coming to your location on foot. 2 personnel with small arms and limited ammunition." Peterson's response was immediate. "Negative, Phoenix. Do not approach our position. It's too dangerous." But Mitchell had already made up her mind. "Sorry, Bulldog. We're already moving. See you in a few minutes." She and Stevens began working their way across the rocky terrain toward the building where the SEALs were making their last stand. Behind them, smoke rose from the wreckage of their Apache helicopter. Ahead of them lay a desperate fight against overwhelming odds. The Taliban fighters, emboldened by the destruction of the American helicopter, were preparing for a final assault on the building. They had the SEALs surrounded, outnumbered, and nearly out of ammunition. Victory seemed within their grasp, but they hadn't counted on a determined female Apache pilot who refused to abandon the men she had come to save. Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Mitchell moved carefully through the rocky terrain, her M4 carbine at the ready as she and Stevens approached the building where the SEALs were trapped. The sounds of intense gunfire grew louder with each step, punctuated by the occasional explosion of grenades or RPGs. Through her radio earpiece, she could hear the increasingly desperate communications from the SEAL team. Their ammunition was running dangerously low, and the enemy was preparing for what appeared to be a final assault. "Phoenix, where are you?" Peterson's voice crackled through the radio, strained with the stress of command in an impossible situation. 200 meters out and closing, Mitchell replied quietly. "We can see your position." From their current location, she and Stevens could observe the tactical situation around the building. Taliban fighters were positioned behind rocks and in shallow depressions, creating a complete circle around the structure. Many were armed with RPGs and machine guns, while others carried assault rifles and grenades. Stevens, studying the enemy positions through his rifle scope, counted at least 18 active fighters. "This is suicide," he whispered to Mitchell. "We can't take on that many enemies with just 2 rifles." But Mitchell had noticed something that Stevens had missed. The Taliban fighters were so focused on the building containing the SEALs that they had positioned themselves with their backs to the approach route she and Stevens were using. It was a tactical oversight that she intended to exploit. "We don't have to take them all," she replied quietly. "We just need to create enough chaos to break up their assault." She studied the enemy positions more carefully, looking for the key targets that would have the greatest impact. Near the center of the Taliban force was a fighter with an RPG launcher who appeared to be directing the assault. Taking him out would disrupt their coordination and eliminate their most dangerous weapon. "See the guy with the RPG about 100 meters from the building?" She pointed him out to Stevens. "He's running the show." Stevens nodded, adjusting his rifle scope. "I see him. But once we start shooting every Taliban fighter down, they're going to know where we are." Mitchell checked her ammunition one more time. She had 5 30-round magazines for her M4, plus her sidearm. It wasn't much for a firefight against nearly 20 enemies, but it would have to do. "We hit them fast and hard, then displace to a new position," she explained her plan. "Keep them confused about how many of us there are and where we're attacking from." Inside the building, the situation was becoming desperate. Rodriguez was down to his last magazine, and several team members were completely out of rifle ammunition. They were relying on their sidearms and the few remaining grenades they carried. "Contact front," Williams shouted as another group of Taliban fighters tried to rush the building. The SEALs' return fire was noticeably lighter now, their depleted ammunition forcing them to be extremely selective with their shots. The Taliban fighters were beginning to realize that their enemies were running out of bullets. Thompson, the team's sniper, had been reduced to using his sidearm after expending all his rifle ammunition. "This next assault is going to succeed if we don't get help soon," he reported grimly. Peterson knew his teammate was right. They had held out longer than anyone had a right to expect, but they were reaching the end of their ability to resist. He got on the radio to coordinate with Mitchell. "Phoenix, we are critically low on everything," he reported. "Next enemy assault will likely overrun our position." "Copy that, Bulldog," Mitchell replied. "Beginning our attack now. When you hear our fire, be ready to engage any targets of opportunity." Mitchell and Stevens had positioned themselves on a small ridge overlooking the Taliban positions. From here, they had clear shots at several enemy fighters who were preparing to assault the building. Simultaneous engagement. Mitchell whispered to Stevens. "You take the RPG gunner. I'll take the machine gunner on the left. On 3. Stevens centered his crosshairs on the Taliban commander with the RPG launcher. The man was gesturing to his fighters, apparently giving final instructions for the assault on the building. 1, 2, 3. Both rifles fired simultaneously. Stevens' shot took down the RPG gunner instantly, while Mitchell's bullet found the machine gunner who had been providing covering fire for the assault teams. The effect on the Taliban force was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, under attack from an unexpected direction, the fighters scattered for cover, their carefully planned assault dissolving into chaos. "What the hell?" one of the SEALs shouted from inside the building as enemy fire suddenly shifted away from their position. Mitchell and Stevens quickly displaced to a new firing position, moving along the ridgeline as they continued to engage the confused Taliban fighters. Their precise shooting was taking a toll on the enemy force, but it was also drawing return fire in their direction. "There!" shouted one of the Taliban fighters in Arabic, pointing toward the ridge where muzzle flashes had revealed the pilot's position. Several enemy fighters turned their attention away from the building to engage this new threat. AK-47 rounds cracked past Mitchell's head as she took aim at another target. The diversion was exactly what the SEALs needed. With enemy attention divided between two threats, they were able to engage Taliban fighters who had exposed themselves while trying to locate the new attackers. Rodriguez, using his last magazine, took careful aim at enemy fighters who were now visible as they turned to face the threat from the ridge. His years of training and combat experience showed as each shot found its mark. Multiple enemy Kia, Peterson reported as the SEALs took advantage of the tactical opportunity Mitchell and Stevens had created. But the Taliban fighters were experienced combat veterans who quickly adapted to the changing situation. They began moving to positions that provided cover from both the building and the ridge, while some fighters attempted to flank Mitchell and Stevens' position. "They're trying to get behind us," Stevens warned as he spotted movement on their left flank. Mitchell realized their position was becoming untenable. "Time to move," she decided. "We need to link up with the ground team." But reaching the building meant crossing nearly 200 meters of open ground while under fire from multiple directions. It was the kind of movement that would normally be supported by heavy weapons and close air support. "Cover me," Mitchell told Stevens as she prepared to make a run toward the building. She sprinted down the slope, dodging between rocks as enemy fire erupted around her. Taliban fighters who had been focused on the SEALs now turned their attention to the running figure, their AK-47s chattering as they tried to bring her down. Stevens provided covering fire from the ridge, his precise shooting forcing enemy fighters to keep their heads down. But he couldn't cover all the Taliban positions, and Mitchell was taking fire from multiple directions. An RPG round exploded just meters behind her as she ran, the blast wave knocking her forward but not stopping her momentum. She rolled behind a large boulder and immediately began returning fire at the nearest enemy positions. "Phoenix, what's your location?" Peterson radioed. 50 meters northwest of your position," Mitchell replied between bursts of gunfire. "Trying to reach you." From the building, the SEALs could see Mitchell pinned down behind the boulder. Enemy fighters were moving to flank her position, and she would soon be overrun if they didn't act. "Ghost, Hammer, we're going out to get her," Peterson decided. Rodriguez and Williams looked at their ammunition status. Rodriguez had perhaps 10 rounds left, while Williams was down to his sidearm. It was barely enough for a firefight, but they couldn't leave the pilot to face the Taliban alone. "Ready," Rodriguez confirmed. The two SEALs burst from the building simultaneously, laying down suppressive fire as they moved toward Mitchell's position. Their unexpected assault caught the Taliban fighters off guard, and several enemies fell to their precise shooting. Mitchell saw the SEALs moving toward her position and immediately began displacing toward them, firing as she moved. The three Americans linked up behind a cluster of rocks that provided better cover than Mitchell's original position. "Glad to see you," Rodriguez said as he slammed his last magazine into his rifle. "Feelings mutual," Mitchell replied, checking her own ammunition. She was down to 2 magazines plus her sidearm. Stevens, still on the ridge, continued providing overwatch fire. But he could see that the Taliban fighters were regrouping and preparing for another assault. The Americans had disrupted their plans, but they still held numerical superiority. Multiple fighters massing for assault, Stevens reported over the radio. At least 12 tangos moving on your position. The situation remained desperate despite the successful link-up. The combined American force now consisted of 6 SEALs and 2 pilots, but their ammunition situation was critical. They had perhaps 2 minutes of sustained combat before running completely dry. Peterson made a tactical decision based on their ammunition constraints. "We make a fighting withdrawal to the ravine," he ordered. "It's our only chance." The ravine he was referring to lay about 100 meters north of their current position. It offered concealment and defensible positions, but reaching it would require fighting through enemy forces while carrying wounded personnel. Anderson, the youngest SEAL, had taken shrapnel in his left arm from an earlier grenade explosion. He could still fight, but his effectiveness was reduced. Stevens also had a head injury from the helicopter crash that was affecting his balance. "Leapfrog movement," Peterson ordered. "Team Alpha provides covering fire while Team Bravo moves." On my mark. Mitchell found herself assigned to Team Alpha along with Rodriguez and Thompson. It felt strange to be taking orders from a Navy SEAL, but she recognized Peterson's tactical expertise and followed his lead without question. "Mark!" Peterson shouted. Team Alpha opened fire on the nearest Taliban positions, while Team Bravo sprinted toward the ravine. The combined firepower of 4 rifles was enough to suppress the enemy temporarily, but Mitchell could see that several Taliban fighters were moving to cut off their escape route. "Enemies moving to block the ravine," she reported to Peterson. This was exactly the kind of tactical problem that Special Operations Forces trained to solve. Peterson quickly assessed the situation and came up with a solution. "Phoenix, can you and your co-pilot take out those blocking forces while we provide overwatch?" he asked. Mitchell studied the tactical situation. The Taliban fighters moving to block their escape route were exposed as they crossed open ground. With accurate rifle fire, she and Stevens could eliminate them before they reached defensive positions. "Affirmative," she replied. "We'll handle the blocking force." Stevens had heard the conversation over the radio and was already moving down from the ridge to a position where he could engage the Taliban fighters threatening their escape route. Despite his head injury, his shooting remained accurate. The firefight that followed was brief but intense. Mitchell and Stevens engaged the Taliban fighters who were trying to block the ravine while the SEALs provided covering fire. Their combined shooting was effective, eliminating the immediate threat to their escape route. "Blocking force neutralized," Mitchell reported. "Path to ravine is clear." But their ammunition situation was now critical. Several team members were down to their last few rounds, and the Taliban fighters were preparing for another assault. "Move! Move! Move!" Peterson ordered as the entire team began a fighting withdrawal toward the ravine. The Americans moved in a coordinated fashion that demonstrated years of training and combat experience. Each person knew their role in the withdrawal, with some providing covering fire while others moved, then switching roles as they leapfrogged toward safety. Mitchell found herself impressed by the professionalism and skill of the SEAL team. Despite being outnumbered, low on ammunition, and facing overwhelming odds, they maintained their discipline and tactical cohesion. The ravine, when they reached it, provided the defensive positions they desperately needed. The narrow confines limited how many enemies could attack at once, while the rocky walls provided excellent cover from enemy fire. Defensive positions, Peterson ordered as the team established a perimeter in the ravine. But even with better tactical positioning, their fundamental problems remained. They were still outnumbered, still low on ammunition, and still surrounded by enemy forces. The ravine bought them time, but it wasn't a permanent solution. Then, like a gift from heaven, they heard the sound of rotors in the distance. Not the single aircraft sound of a helicopter, but the multiple rotor signatures of a large formation. "Aircraft inbound," Thompson reported, scanning the sky. Multiple birds coming from the south. Through his radio, Peterson could hear the voice of the Quick Reaction Force commander. "Bulldog, this is Razor. We have 8 aircraft inbound to your position with a full company of Rangers. What's your situation? For the first time since the ambush began, Peterson allowed himself to believe they might actually survive. Razor, this is Bulldog. We are in a ravine approximately 200 meters north of the original target building. Enemy forces estimated at 12 to 15 remaining fighters. We are critically low on ammunition. Copy, Bulldog. We have visual on your position. Beginning attack runs now. The sound of approaching helicopters had also been heard by the Taliban fighters. Those who could began withdrawing from their positions, knowing that American air power was about to descend upon them. Others, trapped by the geography of the valley, prepared to fight to the death. Mitchell watched as a formation of Apache helicopters swept into the valley, their 30mm guns already firing at Taliban positions. Behind them came Black Hawk helicopters carrying the Rangers who would secure the area and ensure that no enemy fighters escaped. The battle that had begun with a carefully planned Taliban ambush was ending with the overwhelming application of American military power. Within minutes, the remaining enemy fighters were either dead or fleeing into the mountains. Bulldog, this is Razor, came the voice of the Ranger Company commander. Area is secure. Prepare for extraction. As the dust settled and the gunfire finally stopped, Mitchell looked around at the men she had fought beside. They had all survived an ordeal that should have killed them, and they had done it through a combination of skill, determination, and mutual support. Peterson walked over to where Mitchell was sitting against the ravine wall, checking her equipment. Phoenix, I want you to know that what you did today saved all our lives. Flying into that valley under fire, then coming to help us on foot, that took guts. Mitchell shrugged, though she was clearly moved by the praise. Just doing my job, she replied. Besides, you guys would have done the same for us. Rodriguez overheard the conversation and joined them. Actually, what she did was way beyond her job description, he corrected Peterson. Helicopter pilots aren't supposed to get into ground combat. She chose to do that. As the rescue helicopters landed in the valley below, Mitchell reflected on the events of the day. She had started the morning as a helicopter pilot providing routine support to a SEAL mission. She was ending it as a combat veteran who had fought alongside some of the most elite soldiers in the American military. The official after-action report would record that the mission had been compromised by faulty intelligence and that the SEAL team had been ambushed by a superior enemy force. It would note that close air support had been provided by an Apache helicopter that was subsequently shot down. But it would also record that the helicopter crew had survived their crash and had fought on foot alongside the SEAL team, helping to hold off enemy forces until reinforcements arrived. It would document how a female Apache pilot had refused to abandon the men she had come to support, even when it meant leaving the safety of her aircraft to fight on the ground. For Mitchell, the day had proven something she had always believed but had never had the chance to demonstrate. When American service members were in danger, it didn't matter if you were a pilot, a SEAL, a Ranger, or any other specialty. What mattered was that you didn't leave your people behind. As they boarded the rescue helicopters for the flight back to base, Thompson leaned over to Mitchell. You know, Phoenix, you might want to consider a career change. You're pretty good at this ground combat stuff. Mitchell laughed, the tension of the day finally beginning to fade. Thanks, but I think I'll stick to flying. It's safer up there. The helicopters lifted off from the valley, carrying the survivors of one of the most intense small unit actions of the war in Afghanistan. Behind them, the wreckage of Mitchell's Apache helicopter smoldered in the morning sun, a testament to the price of the battle they had fought and won. The mission had failed to capture or kill the Ghost, who had escaped during the initial confusion of the ambush. But it had succeeded in something more important. It had demonstrated the kind of courage and dedication that defined the American military at its best. In the years that followed, the story of the female Apache pilot who fought on foot alongside a trapped SEAL team will become legendary within the special operations community. It would be told in training schools and repeated in ready rooms, a reminder that heroism comes in many forms and that the warrior spirit knows no gender. For Sarah Mitchell, it was simply another day at the office, a day when she had been tested to her absolute limits and had proven that she belonged among the ranks of America's finest warriors.